Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amani Pilapitiya, and I will be your moderator for this evening. Now, the topic for this evening's discussion is child rights violations, protection and prevention mechanisms. Before we go into this evening's discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce you all to the organizers behind this evening's discussion. This webinar series is a part of a legal education project of Capital Law Chambers and Corporate Consultants, which is being executed by its legal education arm, C4 Legal, with the support and the collaboration of Legal Action Worldwide. Now, Legal Action Worldwide is an organization that works towards equality of all before the law, as well as delivering justice to those who need it the most. Now, some of the key activities that they are involved in include legal aid and legal empowerment, strategic litigation, advocacy, as well as having a particular focus in areas like gender equality, sexual and gender-based violence, rule of law and accountability, as well as transformative justice. Now, moving on to the subject matter of this evening's discussion, I think it goes without saying that some of the news reports that we've been hearing in these last few months, particularly in these last few months, have been alarming to say the least. And it really makes all of us question what exactly the legal mechanisms and what institutions are there for the protection of the rights of children, and how we can all contribute towards more informed and effective changes. Now, what I hope that all of you are able to take away from this evening's discussion is not only a clearer understanding of the legal mechanisms, both domestically and internationally, but also to emphasize the fact that children are rights holders in their own right, and it is important that we empower and we educate them as to these rights. While doing that, we need to also consider how we all can become activists and how we can contribute towards this development. Now, briefly, I'd also like to introduce you to our panel. We have Mr. Asitha Punchihewa, CEO of Panacea Solutions Private Limited. He's a researcher as well as has a vast knowledge and experience in this particular field. We have Mrs. Roma Ranasinghe, attorney at law. She's a freelance consultant to the Ministry of Justice, other international organizations and NGOs, and having a particular focus in areas like human trafficking and labor migration. And we also have Ms. Kate Norton joining us from Switzerland. She's the operations director at Legal Action Worldwide. She's a lawyer qualified in the United Kingdom and has over 15 years of experience in the humanitarian field. I'd also like to briefly explain to you the structure. Thank you very much. Sorry. As I was saying, the structure for this evening's discussion will be such that each of our panelists will have 2 7-minute segments to discuss their content. There will also be a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. I invite you all to send in your questions to the chat box below, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. There will also be a few poll questions that we'll be introducing to the discussion, and I invite you to participate in these as well. Now, moving on to this discussion, I think to start, it's important that we get an overall image or picture of the situation at hand, particularly understanding who exactly the child is and some of the risks and the issues that they are faced with today, and the role that we play with regard to this context. Now, I'd like to introduce and I'd like to invite Mr. Asitha Punchihewa to elaborate a bit further along these lines. Mr. Punchihewa, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. As I move along, I will be looking at my notes as well. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, sir, you are. We can hear you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to join hands with you. And C4 Legal has been doing quite some remarkable work, and it's a pleasure to be working with them. And we'll start this session with the definition of a child. And generally, pediatricians use the term, they take care of children who are below the age of 12 as their clientele. So for a pediatrician, it's 12 years. And the biological explanation of a child is also somewhat similar. And any human being from the childbirth to puberty is considered a child. And according to the Children and Young Persons Ordinance in 1939, a person who is below the age of 14 has been categorized as a child. But the United Nations Child Rights Convention categorizes anyone who is below the age of 18 as a child. And Sri Lanka has been a signatory of the United Nations Child Rights Convention since 1991. And the Universal Declaration of Child Rights describes the term of child rights in terms of right to life, right to development, right to protection, and right to participate. And the Buddhist philosophy also describes the obligation side of it. We have spoken of the rights side of it. And there's a poll coming up. Sorry. According to the Buddhist philosophy, we talk of the obligation to ensure equitable development, obligation to safeguard life, or obligation to protect one from violence and abuse and neglect, and so on. And as a country, we have all the instruments, laws, and legally established structures and the cultural setting to protect the rights of children. We have a dedicated ministry on child development, and we have the National Child Protection Authority, and we have the Police Women and Child Bureau, and we have the Probation and Child Care Department as well. And at the peripheries, we have child rights promotion officers, we have probation officers, and we have a number of INGOs, NGOs, civil society movements, and CBOs operating at different levels and diverse platforms to protect rights of children. And despite having all of these instruments and mechanisms, we still see a lot of abuse and protection issues taking place in Sri Lanka. And we hear day in, day out, we hear children that are being exploited, raped, tortured, burnt, killed, made to commit suicide, and all of that. And children from powerless backgrounds, powerless, landless, wealthless, homeless people are still being exploited by the wealthier and powerful people. And the people with a wealth of power and wealth of resources have the political clout, and they have the capacity to manipulate the system and to influence the system so that they can do whatever they want. That's the ultimate reality of this country. As a country, we have been unable to safeguard the rights of children belonging to the Muslim minority. It is sad to see that these proposed reforms that were not accommodated by the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. This act has in fact given a legal privilege for abusers to abuse children as they wish. And moving on, we have also seen abusers camouflaging themselves as Buddhist monks as well. And they carry out their abusive practices within temples. Child monks being molested in temples is something that we have started to hear more often or more frequently. Mother migration has been there for the last few decades, and still the grievances of children whose parents have migrated are yet to be addressed in a sustainable manner. Child pornography and child sex work are two areas that have kept on evolving during the last few decades, and in the era of improved internet facilities, more dimensions are being added to this whole scenario. Organized child trafficking is quite visible, and very recently there are some politicians involved in this whole dialogue, and we can see that whole thing shedding light on the existence of child trafficking and forced labor. And moving on from child trafficking, forced labor, and sexual exploitation, we should not rule out the existence of organ removal as well, which is not spoken of very broadly in Sri Lanka. But I am quite sure that this particular phenomenon is existing in large scale. And there are over 6,000 street children in Colombo alone. And even in other districts and provinces, there are many street children. And they could well be candidates for organ removal. And human trafficking rings have built their networks with high-ranking personalities who could influence the law enforcement system and the structure. Creating a safe and protective environment poses a huge challenge in the context where children are abused in their own homes. Now we think that the abusers live outside the community, but it's within their homes and houses that children are getting abused most prevalently. It's even at times children are being abused by their own fathers and close family members and respected individuals of the society like teachers and clergy. And throughout the world, 1 out of 5 girls and 1 out of 13 boys are being abused, and this is an alarming statistic. And those who are abused are likely to carry serious emotional scars throughout their lives, and there's always a likelihood of the abused becoming abusers when they mature.
Mr. Punchihewa, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if we can take on the discussion to your next segment because of time constraints, I'm sorry. I think with that idea in mind and some of the main risks that you have highlighted, I think it's important that we also now understand what exactly the legal framework is in the country at the moment and what institutions are available and the procedures that we have to approach these institutions in Sri Lanka. I'd like to invite Mrs. Roma Ranasinghe to elaborate a bit further on this and give us an idea of this legal framework. Ms. Ranasinghe, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Amani, and thank you very much. I thank C4 Legal for giving me this opportunity to talk on this timely topic. Following the ratification of the Child Rights Convention in 1992, Sri Lanka adopted the Children's Charter and then actually it's not a binding or legal or binding instrument, but it guides us to give the sort of as a policy document to guide Sri Lanka in its policy making legal reforms. Now, I am not going to define the who is a child, because Asitha made a clear statement on defining. Actually, the age of majority is 18 years in terms of the age of majority ordinance 1865, as amended by the age of majority amendment Act number 17 of 1989. There are also provisions in the 1978 Constitution. Chapter 3 of the Sri Lankan Constitution embodies provisions relating to fundamental rights. The fundamental rights defined in the chapter fall into two categories. One category of right is universal in character and applies to every person, and the other category of rights applies to every citizen. Articles 14, 19, and 37 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child fall into the first category, which is protected by our Constitution. Article 10 of the Constitution recognizes as a fundamental right of every person freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, including the right to adopt a religion or belief of his choice. This is a justiciable fundamental right. Article 11 of the Constitution recognizes as a fundamental right that no person shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. This is also a justiciable fundamental right. Article 19 of the Convention, however, is more inclusive in scope in defining the state's responsibility for protecting the child. It includes all forms of physical and mental violence, maltreatment, and abuse. The legislation on children's rights dates back to the colonial era, and the penal code was enacted. There's a poll coming on. Enacted in 1883, provides for the protection of children. An amendment to the Penal Code Section 75 and 76 on the minimum age for criminal liability was amended by Act number 10 of 2018, increasing the age from 8 to 12 years. The legal parameters pertaining to the minimum age for employment changed. The Employment of Women, Young Persons and Children's Act number 47 of 1995 was amended by Act number 22 of 2021, increasing the minimum age for employment from 14 to 16 years. Moving on to recruitment, like children between the ages of 16 to 18 years can only be recruited for jobs that do not pose a threat to their life, health, education, and moral development. And it is strictly prohibited to recruit them for unsafe jobs or jobs that require them to work at night. The Ministry of Labour has decided to expand the list of jobs considered to be hazardous to children between 16 to 18. The list to be increased now, right at the moment, the list there are 52 hazardous jobs in the hazardous occupation regulation number 47. So the list will be increased from 52 to 76. Talking about the existing legal framework for preventing child abuse, I would like to draw the attention to 5 significant acts on children. One is the 1995 Penal Code Amendment to the Penal Code Act number 22, which prescribes maximum punishment and a minimum penalty for child abuse offences. The Act describes child cruelty, child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, child pornography or pornography, use or promotion, possession of such publication, holding, selling, distributing, and assisting as child abuse offences. The other one is a Judiciary Amendment Act number 27 of 1998, removes the statutory requirement for a preliminary hearing in cases of rape or rape of a child under 16 years of age. Thirdly, the Penal Code Amendment Act number 29 of 1998 defines the use of children under the age of 18 as a grave offence and imposes penalties on the use of children for begging, hiring of children for sexual intercourse, employment, use of children for the transportation of limited goods such as toxins, opium, and drugs. And the other one is the National Child Protection Act number 50 of 1998, established the National Child Protection Authority for child protection. Its objectives are to prevent child abuse, protect and treat abused children, and develop and coordinate policies and actions to prevent child abuse. Prevention of Domestic Violence Act number 34 2005. Its main objective is to eradicate domestic violence. This actually provide measures to be taken against any domestic violence that may or may not be physical or mental. It can help not only children, women, but also any party affected by domestic violence. Then the newly established National Authority, recently enacted for the protection of victims and witnesses of crime, provides that when determining whether a child is a victim, the child's maximum benefit should be considered. Also, the important part which Asitha mentioned, that on child trafficking. Actually, Amendment number 16 of 2006 to the Penal Code newly introduced under Section 360C on child trafficking. Compulsory education provisions are provided for compulsory education. Recently, there was by Gazette or regulation, it was increased to minimum age 16. Compulsory attendance for children at schools regulation 17 and 18. Then provisions are provided for free public education under Section 47 of the Education Ordinance. Next one is the Circular on Corporal Punishment in schools is prohibited by Circular number 2005-17, titled Maintaining Discipline in School, issued by the Minister of Education 2005 in 2005. Alternative ways of disciplining children are also described in this circular. Then moving on to the institutions, how do we, institutions and procedures responsible for child rights. Ministry of Labour enforce child labour laws and receive public complaints of child labour filed in national and district level officers, and refer cases involving the worst forms of child labour to the police and National Child Protection Authority. The ministry also conducts special investigations in relation to child rights, child labour through the Women and Children's Affairs Division of the ministry. Then there's this Child and Women's Bureau of the Sri Lanka Police. There are divisional bureaus in the 42 territorial divisions and children and women units in 496 police stations in the country. The Bureau enforces laws on child labor, child trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation of children, and the use of children in illicit activities. The National Child Protection Authority.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Ranasinghe, your time allocation has exceeded a bit.
Okay.
If you can discuss the institutions in your next segment, I'll be most grateful.
Okay.
I'd like to move on to our next speaker. I think now we got a very comprehensive understanding of the legal framework within Sri Lanka. I'd like Ms. Norton, if you could illustrate to us what the larger global framework is, particularly the treaties and international institutions that work towards the protection of the rights of the child. Ms. Norton, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me well, Amani?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much. First of all, just a thank you very much to Capital Law Chambers for putting on this very important workshop, and it's obviously an honour and privilege to join this panel with my colleagues. So I've been asked to talk today about the global framework. And as we all know, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the General Assembly in 1989 and subsequently ratified by Sri Lanka. This very much forms the backbone of child rights. However, that's not say that children didn't have rights before 1989, of course, because all of the other human rights instruments also equally apply to children. So the right to life, the right from freedom of torture, and many of the other political, civil, economic, and social rights. And many of those other human rights instruments do actually also refer to children. And even prior to the 20th century and these many human rights instruments, of course, in every culture in the world, there's always been for a long time, since the beginning of time, an understanding of the obligation of parents to look after children, to feed and to clothe them, to protect them from harm, and also to educate them, whether that was life skills or formal education. But I think the thing that's really important is that the Convention on the Rights of the Child was particularly unique because it pulled together the fundamental rights of children into one document. And it also recognizes the very specific vulnerabilities and needs of children. It defines children as persons under the age of 18 unless national legislation says otherwise. And this, of course, is something that my colleague Roma talked about a little bit earlier Asitha in Sri Lanka. But it also, I think very importantly, the Convention on the Rights of the Child recognizes children as actors in the social, cultural, economic and political spaces of our societies. So what we're seeing an awful lot now is that we are recognizing the rights of children also to not only be protected and to have to exercise rights such as education, but we're also seeing them having a right to participate in the decision-making that affects their lives, to be consulted on policies which relate to them, and also to expect and even to demand that there are services that they can have which are adapted to their needs and specific vulnerabilities. Now, the Convention on the Right of the Child is only just one legal instrument. Just interestingly, it's the most ratified legal convention that we have in the world. And notably, the only country that has not ratified the CRC is the United States. But every other country in the world has ratified it. And so that means effectively that it is also customary law as well as hard law. So there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child also has 3 protocols, which you will have heard about. The first one relates to child soldiers. The second one relates to sexual abuse and prostitution of children. And the third one is about allowing children actually to make complaints that their state are not implementing it properly. So it's a very important document. But since then, and even prior, there's been an awful lot of other policies and guidelines that have been introduced. You know, there's various relevant to us as lawyers. There are guidelines around juvenile justice and how children who are in conflict with the law, as well as those that need the protection of the law, but those who are actually accused of crimes, how they should be treated in the legal system as well. 2 also important things to note about the global framework. First of all is the Committee on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which is a UN body that requires all states in the world to report every 5 years about their progress on implementing the convention. And this actually also allows civil society to send in shadow reports saying, basically complimenting or criticizing the state and highlighting where there's been lack of progress. So this is very important. And then there are recommendations made to states. So it's possible to find out what the committee has commented on in relation to every state in the world, including Sri Lanka. The other framework I think is important to highlight at this time, because it's something which a lot of governments are talking about, are the Sustainable Development Goals, which we're all aware of. But a lot of these directly impact on children because they are there to tackle particularly poverty, inequalities, education, gender equality, hunger, these type of things. And if implemented, would also very much affect children. Now, we have a global framework, but the obligation to implement it, as my colleagues have said, is very much the obligation of the state. And that means legislation and policies, as is happening in Sri Lanka. And also very key is the rule of law, because a lot of states struggle in that they have the policies and the legislation and the criminal penal codes, but also what happens is the implementation is following up and making sure that violations are addressed when they're happening. And then the final thing I wanted to mention is that it's very important as part of the global framework also, and a lot of work is done on this internationally, is to address the social norms and attitudes towards children. And what we've seen in many countries is that when governments also tackle this, changes also happen, and particularly some highlights from other contexts, for example, girls' education, or for addressing corporal punishment. A lot of work has also been done on societal expectations about what children have the right to do as well. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Norton. Now, I'd like to invite Mr. Punchihewa, as he discussed before, some of the complex issues that children in Sri Lanka are faced with today. To add to that, I'd like if Mr. Punchihewa could explain a bit further how COVID-19 has particularly impacted the rights of children, as well as the cyberspace. I think this is another major issue that we're facing in today's societies, specifically things like cyberbullying, as well as the role that the media plays in this regard. Mr. Punchihewa.
Now we believe that it's an important area for media to play a huge role in this protection mechanism, and media has an obligation as well to protect the entire society, and especially to talk of the vulnerable and marginalized people, including children. And what we see is not that. Prominence is generally given by mass media. Prominence given by mass media on child protection is not satisfactory. And in fact, I believe that knowingly or unknowingly, media has a tendency to promote child abuse in a way. Now, if we take unethical advertising or advertising in general, and products containing substances unfit for human consumption is widely done. And whenever there is an accusation against a corporation for using a substance unfriendly for human consumption, or carcinogenic substances, for example, margarine, biscuits, chocolate, you name it. At recent times, corporations tend to flood all media channels with advertisements. And these substances carry long-term health impacts on children, and it can even cause death. But the media institutions do not really bother. And children being used for advertising is another concern. And people with some intellect will not support that for children to be used for advertising. And this could even be giving chances for abusers to crack down or track down or trace possible candidates for abuse. And reality shows have given another dimension where abusers get a chance to get to know prospective candidates for abuse. And when it comes to reporting cases of abuse, there's always a saying that children who are being abused have a tendency to get abused by media a few more times. And if you take, for instance, the cases of Vidya and Seya's murders, I would like all of you to think of this context, and if you can recollect the images of the two girls, take a few seconds and recollect the images of the two girls. Do you recollect the perpetrators? If you take a second and try to take an image of the perpetrators, you will not be able to do that. And how the media has portrayed the abuse and the victim, and how the media has been able to portray the abuser. And given the context in Sri Lanka, there's always a chance for the abusers to get pardoned by someone powerful. And tomorrow, the abuser might be attracted to your own child. So that's the dangerous situation of it. And I would also like to suggest a mechanism like a public shaming tool or a blacklisted individuals who have been engaged in child abuse to be publicized on media and social media. We can always discuss that. And when you talk of the COVID-19, the inevitable COVID-19 that has struck us 1.5 years ago, right to life has been obviously compromised, and the pandemic has given a knockout punch for the most destructive species that the world has ever seen. And even though the number of victims that we see out of all, the number of children who are being killed or who are affected is much less compared to the number of elders or senior citizens who are affected. But the new variety or the Delta variant is believed to be causing a lot of complications among children. That's the bad side of it. And the virus seems to be evolving rapidly. And loss of primary caregivers or the breadwinners is something that has a huge series of implications. And household income has dropped significantly across all countries, across all continents and segments of the population. And parents have to put extra hours of work in to make ends meet, and that reflects badly on children, and the care that can be given by parents to their children is reduced. And less money means less food, less access to resources, less access to avenues to get themselves educated and all that. And children have mostly confined to homes, and in urban settlements the situation is even worse, and education structures have more or less collapsed, and learning is limited to or confined to learning online. And a vast majority of children in the developing world mainly have simply no alternatives but to resort to reading conventional textbooks, whereas the haves or the more resource accessible people have the access to the internet. And there are many emerging protection issues as well stemming from COVID-19. Participation is increasingly becoming a phenomenon of the past, and children are increasingly becoming dependent on adults, and they lack social skills and environmental skills. And as they grow into adults, they will lack the skills to work in teams and work as groups and to work with people and environment. And moving on more into cyberspace, and internet has become a must as a role, as there's a clear role of knowledge delivery. And widespread internet use by children has led to increased access to web-based pornography as well. And children have been becoming increasingly vulnerable towards being targets of or being targeted audiences of pornography industry. And the generation gap is also widening with the use of internet, and parents do not have the skills sufficient to monitor children and their use of the internet. Screen addiction is another area, and it has multiple implications and impacts, and that leads to cognitive skills, lowering of cognitive skills and problem solving abilities. And due to sitting long hours in front of the computers, fat deposition in bodies and which leads to heart disease, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, diabetes, and other non-communicable diseases is becoming a large threat. And cyberbullying, as you said, is an emerging area, and social media is one of the key areas through which cyberbullying is taking place. It has become a burden for adults as well, and when children enter their youthhood, cyberbullying will definitely come into play, and children who are affected by low amount of social skills due to lack of movement and interaction with people, they will obviously become candidates for cyberbullying. And when schools reopen, there's another wave of tobacco, alcohol, cannabis, opiates, and crystal meth waiting to grab children. And our children coming out of prolonged confinement in homes and who lack social skills could become easy prey for those menaces. And our role as child protection activists would be firstly to unearth the existing evidence base on cases of child protection and what we should be doing, hold duty bearers accountable, and to make general public aware about the situation and to share information as much as possible. And every individual and an organization have a social obligation to fulfill as well, and this would lead to see a healthy, balanced, strong, productive generation of children, youth, and adults who are able to take the emerging challenges of the world. So with that, I can hand over the session to the next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Punchihewa. I think you raised some crucial social issues and really explained to us what the situation is at the moment. Now, I'd like to invite Mrs. Ranasinghe to speak a bit more on an area I think that she has a specific expertise on, that is human trafficking. And I'd like if she could elaborate a bit further on this aspect of child trafficking as well as child labor. I think also the rights of children in tea plantation communities are also severely affected in today's day and age. Mrs. Ranasinghe, would you be able to explain to us a bit further along these lines?
Yes, Amani. Now, talking about child labor, I just want to define child labor. It's defined in according to ILO IPEC as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development. In most extreme forms of child labor involves children being enslaved, separated from their families, exposed to serious hazards, illnesses, and are left to fend for themselves on the streets of large cities, often at a very early age. Talking about child trafficking is defined in the Penal Code. An amendment was brought into the Penal Code at number 16 of 2006 under Section 360C in complete alignment with international laws and treaties. Child trafficking is an act that recruits, transports, transfers, harbors, or receives a child, or does any other act, whether with or without the consent of such child, for the purpose of securing forced or compulsory labor or services, slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs, prostitution, or other forms of sexual exploitation, or any other act which constitutes an offense under any law shall be guilty of the offense of trafficking. This is under the Section 360C of the Penal Code Amendment at number 16 of 2006. I want to highlight that in this child trafficking, consent of the child is irrelevant. If the act is there and the purpose is there, if the act of, as I mentioned, recruit, transport, or transfer, harbors, or receives a child, that's the act, or any other act, for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation is given as for labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, or removal of organs, or child soldiers. Those are defined as given as exploitative conduct. So those two elements are the most important thing when it comes to child trafficking. And always we have to be, it's very important that child's consent is irrelevant to for this offense. As you know, the widely prevalent forms of child labor in the 1990s and before, such as children in domestic servitude and children engaged in hazardous labor in industries, are drastically declined. The transformation has been the result of greater awareness. I don't know whether some of you might remember the ILO had project 444 awareness program, and law reform and enhanced law enforcement, as well as more businesses steering away from the employment of children. However, two of the country's biggest industries, tea and tourism, still engage children in their enterprises. So I see the push factors, one of the push factors is alcoholism. It's a burning problem in the estate areas. Often the father, sometimes both the parents are addicted to alcohol. So there are fights in the household. When the father is under the influence of alcohol, he quarrels with the mother. The calm family environment is shattered as a result. Since the plantation houses are built in line rooms, the children are evenly disturbed by problems in the nearby households. The next factor is the main reason for child labor is poverty. Parents do not have sufficient income to meet expenses for education, though it is given free. Parents prioritize earning money over giving children a good education. The perception of parents is such that sending the child to work is as seen as credit, and while sending them to school is seen as debit. Besides poverty, lack of education and unawareness of its importance are the main reasons why plantation sector-based parents allow and encourage their children to work. Last year, Amnesty International warned that the disruption of school education caused by COVID-19 pandemic was risking children belonging to the plantation communities being left behind, adding that if the state fails to deliver effective, innovative, timely, and multifaceted responses, children in the plantation communities are in danger of not only dropping out of school, but also being pushed into child labor, including bonded labor. Now, the pull factors are identified that prevent children from escaping exploitative conditions. Children prefer to live with the perpetrators because they enjoy their new lifestyle with good food and comfortable living standards and the economic benefits that assisted their families. Most children were also addicted to drugs, which was funded by the perpetrators. So this is this child trafficking is it's a hidden thing, like those days, like slavery. This is also known as modern day slavery because it's hidden. People are being sold. Unlike those days, it was in public. People were sold in public, but now it's modern day slavery. This is happening, but it's hidden in nature and prevents them from being identified by the authorities and capturing data, which in turn allow them to thrive behind closed doors. It's known as one of the most money-making business in the world, selling of human beings. So Sri Lankan plantation sector contributes almost 30% of the foreign exchange income to the country, and nearly 1 million people in the plantation areas are there. So they are not only a considerable part of the country's economy, but also a considerable portion of the country's general public. So, and it is concerning that such a large and important segment of our society is left impoverished, even while the nation benefits from their hard work. So I think it is time that Sri Lankans, both the public and the authorities, change the mindset that divides such matters into their issues and my issues, and look at the other issues as their own. Because when it comes to addressing issues of children, there is a lot the general public can do to tackle the problem at its roots. So I want to also mention, I didn't have much time to explain about the institutions, about the NCPA. There is a toll-free 24/7 toll-free hotline where anyone can call, a child victim or individual, any community can make a complaint of any child abuse or child labor or violations of child rights. And also there is a mobile app. So anyone can call, and it's important to inform. I think it's a responsibility. So the call, the NCPA calls needing an urgent response are immediately connected. They have the police unit to the special police investigation unit. The unit also inspects premises, interrogate people, and sees property subject to be involved in child abuse, including unlawful child labor. Then the Department of Department of Probation and Child Care Services refer children to centers that provide shelter, medical and legal services, psychological counseling, and life and vocational skills. Also, the National Human Rights Commission, children or their representatives can also file complaints about violations of children's rights with the National Human Rights Commission. Under the Human Rights Commission Act, the Commission has the power to conduct investigations into complaints of violations of fundamental rights. Where an investigation discloses the infringement of a fundamental right, the Commission may refer the matter for reconciliation or mediation. Where this is not successful, the Commission recommends to the appropriate authorities that prosecution or other proceedings be instituted against the perpetrator. Refer the matter to a court or make such recommendation to the appropriate authorities with a view to preventing or remedying the violation. So in facilitating, I think it's everyone have responsibilities to protect the future of the nation or children. I feel that sometimes people are reluctant to make complaints or because they think that they will have to undergo all these unnecessary problems going to court and go to the police to give evidence. But it's always anyone can make a complaint about if they come across or find any, I mean, if you have any, if you are certain and you only need to make sure your concerns are well founded and based on information, you know, or have from reliable source, you can make the complaint to the hotline or any other fax or email or any other, they have this complaint mechanism. Also, identity.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but we're running a bit over our time schedule.
Okay.
I'd like to move on to the next question to Ms. Norton. I think it's interesting if we could get some of your experiences, Ms. Norton, as an international activist and some of the challenges you see internationally, as well as to tell us how Sri Lanka places or our placement in this context.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to my colleagues for some very interesting, rich presentations. I've learned a lot about the context in Sri Lanka and child rights today. So yes, it's a very, obviously the extent to which states are able to implement the global framework is, varies enormously between states which are on, underdevelopment, those which are wealthy, and then of course those which are really fragile and in conflict. And of course, in countries where they are, you know, in conflict, you're very much, when you're working on child rights, you're focusing on very fundamental things like, you know, safety of the children, you know, from you know, horrific human rights violations in conflict, hunger, ability to access education and other areas. For countries that I've worked in, which are middle income, as we would call them, and then an awful lot of them have made a lot of progress in legislation and policies, but some of them face you know, real challenges in implementing those policies. And so what basically happens, a lot of actors involved, and certainly bilateral aid is super important from other state parties to support these institutions and to develop put the policy in place, the education on rights, and things that my colleagues have talked about. UNICEF obviously is an actor that, you know, provides technical advice and also implements development and humanitarian programs. But I think one thing to highlight that is super key in every single society, whether poor, middle income or wealthy, is that civil society in the field of child rights is particularly active, and that means not only international organizations but national organizations, and particularly grassroots organizations. They very much are working, we work with sort of trying to identify the gaps, supporting government to make changes. In very poor countries, they even substitute the government and they provide a lot of the social protection services that normally you would expect the state to provide when there's really no system at all. And in conflict, where the state is completely absent in some countries, then there's an awful lot of substitution of services. So for countries, with middle-income countries, a challenge, and I think everybody's spoken about that today, is about the implementation. But I think one of the challenges which every country in the world faces, regardless of the wealth of the country, is certainly around the prosecution of child abuse and sex abuse, because I think as my colleague Mr. Asitha mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of this happens in the private sphere. So it's very difficult to get the information, to get an accurate account of what has happened, to the evidence, gathering of the evidence, and then the prosecution of the cases. And also a challenge, which is now a global challenge affecting every country in the world, again, as highlighted earlier, is the addressing child abuse that is related to cyber abuse and everything that's in the cyberspace. My personal experience, I've worked a great deal on, obviously, in countries in conflict, and in particularly poor countries, an awful lot of that work has been around the right to education, accessing education, denouncing schools which have been targeted during conflict. Particularly important to work on in many contexts is the right to an identity, which is a very specific child right. We all take it for granted that we have a birth certificate. Without a birth certificate, you can't go to school, you can't sit exams, you cannot get a job, and you can't inherit, you can't prove who was your father. In some countries, you can't get a nationality. And this, basically not having a birth certificate, is so fundamental for us all, and starts, of course, with children, is that you're condemning children to a life of poverty and marginalization and discrimination. And if you can't address that, so an awful lot of work is done around trying to support governments to ensure that every child has that birth certificate, or it's replaced if it's destroyed in a natural disaster or a conflict. And that's something that's super important. In countries which are more developed as well, we've done quite a lot of work on child abuse. You're working with prosecutors and lawyers to implement, to actually pursue these cases, capacity building, representing children in cases, ensuring that they are dealt with by the courts in a sensitive manner. And that's something that's very important. Very finally, on my comments on Sri Lanka, I think it's clear, I obviously defer to the experts on this panel, but it's very clear that obviously Sri Lanka has made a lot of progress. There's some very sort of positive developments around child labour in particular. Sri Lanka is outstanding in the region for addressing that and raising the age, I understand, to 16. That's fantastic. There's this, we're working towards a minimum age, defining a child as 18. There's been a landmark Supreme Court case on corporal punishment. So there's lots of things to be very proud of. Certainly from our experience in relation to the justice system, I think certainly having state attorneys specialising in child protection cases, I think would be something that would be very beneficial. Processing these cases more quickly, monitoring children across the judicial system, and certainly also police stations, the judicial system being more child friendly as well. That's other things that are important as well. So I don't know whether that answers your question. I hope that's
yes, it does. Thank you very much. It was very clear, giving us an overall view. Actually, we've received a few questions to our chat box. I'd like to direct the first question to Mr. Punchihewa. Mr. Punchihewa, do you think society has understood the exact meaning of child abuse? And what are your suggestions for improving the media's role here? I think this is particularly asking that the aspect of mental abuse as well, and not necessarily limited to physical abuse. What is your take on this?
Yeah, the knowledge that people, general public has on child protection or child abuse or child rights is quite limited, and it's very recently that certain segments of knowledge has been added to the curriculums in secondary education on child protection and child abuse. And there are still ongoing debates on the introduction of comprehensive sexuality education as well. And within that kind of a backdrop, it's quite difficult or ambitious for us to believe that things will move forward in a really fast rate. But making people aware through any existing mechanism would be the best way to go. And conventional media seems to be missing something, and the general following on the mass media is also getting reduced number of audiences. But in that kind of a backdrop, I think it would be more pragmatic to think of using social media as much as possible to make aware different segments of the society on issues related to child protection and abuse. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you very much, Mr. Punchihewa. The next question I'd like to direct to Mrs. Ranasinghe. Can we make a report anonymously? And what would this procedure be? I think this is a very important area that everyone would like to know about.
Yes, anyone can make an anonymous complaint or report and to the hotline or by mail or post. They will actually, if anybody makes a complaint to the hotline, anyway, their number will be registered, but they will keep the information confidential. I think that's why I mentioned that people are reluctant to make complaints or just ignore things because they don't want to get into trouble. They thinking that they will have to go to courts or police to give evidence. No, but if you have sufficient, enough information or who suspect on reasonable grounds that a child or young person is at risk of significant harm, should report their concern to the Child Protection toll-free helpline. You don't have to be certain, you only need to make sure your concerns as well founded and based on information you know or have from a reliable source. So anonymous complaints can be made to the hotline.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ranasinghe. We have one more question. Ms. Norton, I'd like if you could address this. How have countries, or I guess the international community, responded to issues faced by children during the pandemic? Is there some general standard that has been adopted in this situation? And how can we improve these standards?
Yes, that's a really good question. There's been a lot of observation that child abuse and has increased neglect, and I think, as was mentioned earlier, the economic impact of COVID on poor families has made the access to food very challenging, and also, as highlighted earlier, the access to education and a lot of what we call digital poverty. So I think it was mentioned earlier, is that children not being able to access education because they don't have access to this Zoom at home. So there's been a lot of talk about it, and programs have been implemented in some parts of the world to try and address this: more monitoring, more outreach, more financial support to particularly vulnerable families in this period. But they're all seen as quite temporary. Also, very importantly, and I think this is something for us as lawyers to think about, is still, because a lot of courts have closed in the pandemic, and several countries that I've been working alongside have implemented special emergency protection order procedures for children during the pandemic. That's something very important. Other issues, interesting, another issue coming up right now in Western countries is the issue around vaccinations and children under the young people, whether or not they could have the right to a vaccination if a parent don't allow that. So that's another very interesting debate that's coming up right now in relation to as you know, the age going through the age groups for vaccinations. So yes, there are some measures that have been taken in place across the world to address this issue. But obviously the overwhelming view is, as was said earlier, is that it has just made matters a lot worse, compounded inequalities, and resulted in significant increases in poverty and abuse for the most vulnerable children, unfortunately, yes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Norton. I'd also like to ask a question, Mr. Punchihewa, with regard to something you brought up a bit earlier as to the creation of a child sex offender register or child sex offender register. Now, I'd like to get an idea of, like, within the region, are there such registers in the South Asian region, and you see this as an upcoming amendment or something that should be introduced in the near future in Sri Lanka?
I think with public dialogue and use of social media, this kind of a mechanism can be easily made, like in the form of an app. And you don't have to necessarily wait for the state to take initiative. A simple organization or a group of individuals can even do it, and it will definitely have a lot of potential and to evolve. And I don't know, I'm not aware of any such instrument. And even at the global scale, if someone is willing to do an app like that, it will have some good potential.
Thank you very much, Mr. Punchihewa. I think now we will be coming to an end because we have run over our time. We've received quite a few questions to our chat box, and I think if we can direct some of these questions to our panelists, we should be able to get the answers to you and send it through our email. Now, with that, I'd like to thank everyone who participated with us this evening. We greatly appreciate your support. And my sincere thanks to our panel, Mr. Asitha Punchihewa, Mrs. Roma Ranasinghe, and Ms. Kate Norton. Thank you so much for your contribution and your time. I'd like to also thank our C4 legal team, Mr. Gamini Pathiranage at eFit Private Limited, for all the technical assistance behind this webinar series. I'd like to also thank Dr. Dayani Panagoda and Indika Pereira, attorney at law, for all their support. I'd like to also highlight that further profiles on our panel are available at our website, c4legal.org. There is also access to some links and further material on our website. So I invite you all to visit the website. In our series, there is one more webinar that will be held on the 26th of August. It will be on gender and the application of the law. And I invite you all to register for that as well and hope to see you then. Thank you and have a very good evening, everyone.